What if you embark on a journey without knowing if you'll ever return? When not only new countries are waiting behind the horizon, but perhaps also your end. This is exactly the risk Ferdinand Magellan took when he set out to find a new route to the Spice Islands, and unintentionally made history in the process. But before we dive deeper, I have a question for you. Do you think Magellan and his crew really knew how big the Earth is, or did they just sail into complete unknown? Write your opinion in the comments below. I'm curious what you think. If you are fascinated by such real adventures where courage, determination, and risk meet, then support the whole thing with a like and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss anything. Because the story that begins now is not just a journey across the seas, but a journey that has changed our image of the world forever. Chapter 1: The Dream of the West. At the beginning of the 16th century, the world was bigger, more mysterious, and at the same time more alluring than ever before. Europe was in an age of awakening, in which old ideas began to falter and new horizons beckoned. Traders, sailors, and adventurers dreamed of discovering riches, gaining fame, and finding paths that no one had trodden before. At the center of all these dreams was a precious destination: the Spice Islands, those distant places in Southeast Asia that were known for their treasures such as nutmeg, cloves, and pepper. These spices weren't just luxury goods. They were so valuable that they were often weighed in gold. But access to these riches was difficult and dangerous. The traditional trade route was overland through the Ottoman Empire or along long, controlled sea routes around Africa, which were dominated by Portugal. Portugal had gained a decisive advantage through skillful navigation and determined expeditions. By circumnavigating the Cape of Good Hope, it had established a direct sea route to India and thus controlled much of the spice trade. For other powers, especially Spain, however, this path remained closed or at least severely restricted. In this world full of competition and ambition, a man grew up who saw things differently: Ferdinand Magellan. Born in Portugal, he gained experience at sea at an early age and took part in expeditions. He knew the dangers of the ocean, the unpredictability of the weather, and the harshness of life on board. But it was precisely these experiences that formed a vision in him that was greater than anything he had experienced before. Magellan was convinced that there had to be another way to the Spice Islands, a way to the west. While most seafarers sailed east, along the well-known routes of Africa and Asia, he thought in the opposite direction. The Earth, as was already accepted among scholars at that time, was a sphere. If this was true, it should theoretically be possible to reach the Spice Islands by simply sailing in the other direction. But theory and practice were two completely different things. No one knew exactly how big the Earth really was. Maps were inaccurate, many regions were completely unexplored, and distances were often underestimated or miscalculated. For many, the idea of sailing west sounded like a risky game with death. What if the ocean was endless? What if there was no passage? Or worse, what if supplies were insufficient and the crew starved to death on the open sea? But Magellan did not let these doubts stop him. On the contrary, they only seemed to drive him even more. He studied charts, talked to other seafarers, and immersed himself in the latest findings in navigation. A daring idea took shape in his mind: an expedition that could not only open up a new trade route, but also grasp the world in its entirety. His plan was bold. He wanted to sail west, cross the Atlantic, and search for a passage along the coast of a still largely unknown continent that would lead him to another sea. This sea, which he could only guess existed, would eventually take him to the Spice Islands. It was a plan that required courage, perseverance, and an almost unwavering conviction. But as visionary as his idea was, it was not met with enthusiasm everywhere. In Portugal, his homeland, Magellan found little support. The Portuguese king saw no reason to finance such a risky enterprise, as his empire already had a functioning trade route. In addition, Magellan was not without controversy. His demands, his tenacity, and perhaps also his pride made him a difficult personality at court. For many, this rejection would have meant the end of such a dream. But for Magellan, it was merely an obstacle, one that had to be overcome. If Portugal didn't want to help him, he had to look elsewhere. And so he began to turn his gaze to another kingdom, Spain. At that time, Spain was an emerging empire that was in competition with Portugal. It was looking for ways to expand its influence and open up new trade routes. For the Spanish crown, Magellan's idea could be just what it needed, a chance to bypass the Portuguese lead and gain direct access to the coveted spices. Magellan knew he had to convince. Not only with words, but with a clear plan, with calculations, maps, and above all, with his own determination. He presented his vision as more than just an expedition. It was a way to make history, secure wealth, and push the boundaries of the known. But even if he did find support, the biggest challenge remained, the unknown. The ocean was not a friendly place. Storms could destroy ships, diseases could wipe out entire crews, and the fear of the unknown could drive even the bravest men mad. Such a journey required not only a strong leader, but also a crew willing to follow him, even when doubts arose. Magellan was aware of this responsibility. His vision was not only a personal dream, but also a risk for anyone who would join him. And yet he was willing to take this risk. For him, the idea of expanding the boundaries of the world was stronger than any fear. So the dream of the West began not with a fleet or a journey, but with an idea. An idea that swam against the current, that questioned existing certainties, and that required the courage to embrace the unknown. It was the beginning of an adventure that would not only change Magellan's life, but also the understanding of the entire world. And while Europe was still hesitating, while kings weighed up and scholars discussed, Magellan was already standing at the edge of the ocean, ready to take the first step in a new direction. Chapter 2: Portugal Rejects. The dream of the West had long since become more than just a vague idea for Ferdinand Magellan. It had developed into a clear plan in his head, a vision that he could not let go. But as convincing as this vision was for himself, it proved difficult to inspire others, especially in his own homeland Portugal. Portugal was one of the world's leading maritime powers at the beginning of the 16th century. For decades, Portuguese explorers had mapped the coasts of Africa, established trading bases, and finally found a direct sea route to India by sailing around the Cape of Good Hope. This success had brought the country not only wealth, but also power and influence. The spice trade was firmly in Portuguese hands, and each new expedition was carefully planned to secure this supremacy. In this context, Magellan's proposal almost seemed like a provocation. Why would Portugal seek an entirely new risky route to the west when there was already a working and profitable route to the east? For the decision-makers at court, the answer was clear: there was no reasonable reason to take such a risk. Magellan, however, saw it differently. For him, the existing sea route was not only long and dangerous, but also politically limited. The world was bigger than many believed, and there had to be alternatives. His idea was not just a different way, it was a challenge to the existing order. With this conviction, he appeared before the Portuguese King Manuel I. Magellan presented his plan emphatically, based on maps, calculations, and his own experiences as a navigator. He argued that the Spice Islands could also be reached by the west, and that Portugal could thus further expand its power. But the court was not impressed. For many advisors, Magellan's plan sounded too speculative, too uncertain, and above all, too expensive. Expeditions were costly undertakings, and failure could mean enormous losses. In addition, Magellan was not a blank slate. His career had already brought tensions and conflicts, and not everyone at court trusted him or thought he was the right man for such an enterprise. In addition, Magellan was not prepared to moderate his demands. He demanded not only support, but also recognition and influence. If his expedition was successful, he wanted to share in the profits and gain an important position. For a man who had already fallen from grace, this seemed arrogant to many. This decision hit him hard, but it didn't break him. On the contrary, it strengthened his resolve to implement his plan anyway. If Portugal did not recognize its vision, then perhaps another kingdom would act wiser. But before he could take this step, Magellan had to cross a personal boundary. His loyalty to Portugal was deep-rooted. He had served for his country, sailed under his flag, and spent much of his life in the service of the crown. Turning away from Portugal now meant not only a political, but also an emotional break. Nevertheless, the decision was inevitable. Magellan felt misunderstood and underestimated. His vision was not seen as an opportunity, but dismissed as a risk. For a man with his ambition, this was difficult to accept. At this stage of his life, a crucial characteristic of his character became apparent: his intransigence. Magellan was not the type of person who was discouraged by setbacks. On the contrary, resistance only seemed to make him stronger. He was willing to risk everything to make his dream come true. So he began to look around for new opportunities. His gaze fell on Spain, the great rival kingdom in the west of the Iberian Peninsula. Spain was hungry for success, for influence, and for new trade routes. It was a country that was willing to take risks, especially if it could result in an advantage over Portugal. Magellan knew he needed more than just a good plan. He had to prove that he was determined, capable, and loyal enough to lead such an expedition. At the same time, he had to leave his past behind and reposition himself. Tensions with Portugal continued to escalate during this time. Magellan increasingly came into conflict with the authorities, and his relationship with the crown finally deteriorated. Finally, he took a step that could be seen as a betrayal. He left Portugal to offer his services to another king. Portugal had closed the door to him, but at the same time it had forced him to look for a new path. And it was precisely this path that would bring him closer to his goal than would ever have been possible before. So Chapter 2 ended not with a failure, but with a turning point. The dream of the West lived on, no longer as a Portuguese project, but as the vision of a man willing to cross borders, both geographically and politically. And as Magellan approached Spain, it slowly began to become apparent that his journey would not only change the world, but also himself. Chapter 3: Support from Spain. When Ferdinand Magellan turned his back on Portugal, he not only entered a new country, but also a completely new political stage. At that time, Spain was an empire on the move, characterized by ambition, competitiveness, and the unconditional will to keep up with other great powers, especially Portugal. For Magellan, this meant an opportunity. But it was not an easy one. Because although Spain was open to new ideas, this did not mean that every plan was immediately approved. At the beginning, Magellan had to prove himself. He was a stranger, a Portuguese in a country that was in competition with his homeland. His appearance was critically eyed, his intentions questioned. Why trust a man whom his own kingdom had rejected? This question hung like a shadow over his first steps in Spain. But Magellan was prepared. He knew he needed more than just a vision, he needed allies. People with influence who were willing to listen to him and carry his idea forward. One of the most important supporters was a man named Juan de Aranda, an influential official who quickly saw the potential of Magellan's plan. Aranda understood that this was not just about an expedition, but about the possibility of shifting the balance of power in Europe. With his help, Magellan managed to gain access to the right circles. Step by step, he worked his way closer to the center of power. Rui Falero also played a decisive role in this. Falero was an experienced scholar and supported Magellan with scientific arguments, calculations, and maps. Together, they formed a strong team, one an experienced seafarer, the other a brilliant thinker. Their strategy was clear. They presented the expedition not only as a voyage of discovery, but also as an economic and political opportunity. Spain, they argue, could get direct access to the Spice Islands without having to use Portuguese routes. This would not only mean enormous profits, but also end dependence on Portugal. Finally, they reached the court of Charles V. The young king was still at the beginning of his reign, but he was ambitious and open to projects that could bring fame and fortune to his empire. At the same time, he was surrounded by advisors who carefully weighed every decision. An expedition like Magellan's was expensive, risky, and full of uncertainties. The presentation was decisive. Magellan and Falero explained their route, showed maps, and explained their calculations. They emphasized that the Spice Islands, depending on the interpretation of the treaties at the time, could possibly be in the Spanish sphere of influence if they were reached from the west. That was a decisive point, because it was not only about discovery, but also about right and possession. The discussions at court were intense. Some consultants were enthusiastic about the idea, others expressed great doubts. No one could say for sure whether the plan would work. The world had not yet been fully mapped, and many assumptions were based on estimates and theories. But it was precisely in this uncertainty that the opportunity also lay. Spain had less to lose than Portugal, as it did not yet have direct access to the Spice Islands. For Charles V, the expedition was a risk, but also an opportunity to make history. Finally, the decision was made. In 1518, Charles V agreed to support Magellan's expedition. It was a moment of enormous importance, not only for Magellan personally, but for the entire history of discoveries. However, the agreement was subject to conditions. Magellan and Falero were given titles and privileges, including shares of the profits and the prospect of power over newly discovered territories. At the same time, the expedition remained under the control of the Spanish crown. It was an alliance based on mutual benefit, and on trust that had yet to prove itself. For Magellan, this decision meant the fulfillment of a first major milestone. His dream was no longer just an idea, but an official project. But with the support came new challenges. Now a plan had to become reality. The organization of the expedition began. Ships had to be procured, equipped, and manned. Provisions were stored, maps were studied, and routes were planned. Every step was crucial, because mistakes could not be easily corrected later. At the same time, new tensions arose. Not everyone in Spain was happy that a Portuguese was leading a Spanish expedition. There was mistrust, rivalry, and open rejection. Some officers questioned Magellan's authority, others doubted his plan. Magellan now had to prove himself not only as a visionary, but also as a leader. He had to assemble a crew that trusted him while dealing with criticism that weakened his position. It was a balancing act between assertiveness and diplomacy. Despite all the difficulties, he remained focused. His goal was clear, and nothing could dissuade him. The support of Spain had given him the opportunity to make his dream come true, but the real road still lay ahead of him. As the preparations progressed, the tension grew. The expedition was no ordinary undertaking. It was a leap into the unknown, a venture that would make the difference between success and failure. Everyone involved knew that this trip was unlike anything they had done before. For Magellan, however, it was more than just an expedition. It was proof that his idea was right, that it was worth fighting against resistance, that even a rejection, like the one from Portugal, could only be one step on the way to success. So a new chapter began under the Spanish flag. A dream became a plan a project, and a project would soon become a journey that would change the world forever. Chapter 4: The Fleet Forms. With the official support of Charles V, Ferdinand Magellan began a new phase of his mission, a phase in which visions had to become tangible reality. What had previously consisted of maps, calculations, and persuasion now took concrete shape. The biggest challenge was to organize an expedition that was not only technically possible, but also resilient enough to survive a journey into the complete unknown. The first step was to assemble the fleet. 5 ships were to form the basis of this daring undertaking. These were not newly built, perfectly tuned ships for an extraordinary mission, but existing ships that were adapted, repaired, and equipped. This fact alone already showed the conditions under which the expedition was prepared. It was not a luxuriously planned project, but a pragmatic undertaking with limited resources. The flagship of the expedition was the Trinidad, the command center from which Magellan was to lead the journey. In addition, there was the San Antonio, the largest ship in the fleet, which was particularly important for transporting supplies. The Concepcion, the Victoria, and the Santiago completed the group. Each of these ships had its own task, its own crew and its own weaknesses. The preparation of these ships was an elaborate process. They had to be made seaworthy, reinforced, and equipped with everything necessary for a long journey. This included not only sails and ropes, but also navigation instruments, spare parts, and weapons. Because no one knew what dangers they would encounter, be they storms, unknown coasts, or hostile encounters. A particularly critical point was the supply. The expedition had to carry enough provisions for months, maybe even years. Dried meat, hard bread, oil, wine, and water were loaded in large quantities. But even with careful planning, one problem remained. Food could spoil, water could become scarce, and disease could spread on board. Supply was not only a logistical task, but a question of survival. In addition to the material preparations, the selection of the crew was of decisive importance. A total of several hundred men were to take part in the expedition: sailors, officers, craftsmen, interpreters, and even some clergymen. Each of them had a role to fulfill, but not all were on board for the same reasons. Some were looking for adventure, others hoped for wealth or fame. Still others had no choice and were recruited or enlisted. This mixture made the team a complex community in which different interests, expectations, and personalities collided. For Magellan, it was crucial to lead this group and keep it together. But this is exactly where the first problems began. Many of the officers were Spaniards, while Magellan himself was Portuguese. This constellation led to tensions that were already noticeable before the departure. Some officers accepted his authority only reluctantly, others openly distrusted him. The rivalry between Spain and Portugal played a major role in this. Magellan was seen by some as a stranger, as someone who may not have been acting in the interests of Spain. These doubts were dangerous, because they could undermine discipline and jeopardize the entire expedition. Magellan responded with determination. He knew that he could not show any weakness. His authority had to be clear and unambiguous if he wanted to maintain control. At the same time, however, he also had to be strategic in order not to escalate conflicts before the journey had even begun. While the ships were being prepared, the port of Seville became a place full of activity and excitement. Workers loaded the ships, merchants delivered goods, and families said goodbye to their loved ones. It was a place of departure, but also of uncertainty. Many of the men knew that they might never return. The journey was risky, and there was no guarantee of success. Nevertheless, they boarded, driven by hope, duty, or simply the fact that there was no alternative. The organization of the hierarchy on board was also of great importance. Everyone had to know who they were subordinate to and what tasks they had to fulfill. Discipline was essential for survival at sea, because at critical moments, chaos could be deadly. Magellan carefully structured the leadership, appointed captains, and established clear lines of command. But despite these measures, a feeling of insecurity remained. The expedition was too large, too complex, and too risky to be completely controllable. Another important aspect was navigation. At that time, navigation methods were still limited and often inaccurate. Compasses, astrolabes, and simple maps were the most important tools. But many regions that Magellan wanted to reach were hardly mapped or not mapped at all. This meant that a large part of the journey had to be improvised. Decisions had to be made on the basis of observations, experience, and intuition. Mistakes could have fatal consequences. A wrong course could lead the expedition into uncharted waters or cost valuable time. Despite all these challenges, the expedition slowly took shape. The ships were ready, the crew was on board, and the final preparations were completed. It was a moment when hope and fear were close together. For Magellan himself, this was the moment he had been working towards for so long. His dream was no longer just an idea. It lay before him, in the form of 5 ships, ready to set sail. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. The real test would not begin until the fleet left the harbor and faced the open sea. There, far away from support and security, it would become clear whether his plan would last. When everything was finally prepared, there was a tense expectation in the air. The expedition was about to leave, and everyone involved felt that something extraordinary was about to happen. 5 ships, hundreds of men, and a destination farther away than anything they could have imagined. The fleet was ready, but the journey ahead would change everything. Chapter 5: Departure into the Unknown. The moment for which Ferdinand Magellan had worked for so long had finally arrived. After months of intensive preparation, endless discussions, and growing tensions, the fleet was ready. The 5 ships, heavily laden with supplies, equipment, and the hopes of an entire nation, waited to leave the safe harbor and venture out into the unknown. The departure took place in 1519 from Seville, one of the most important cities in Spain and a center for trade and seafaring. But before the ships could reach the open ocean, they first had to sail down the Guadalquivir River, a slow and careful process. Already here it became clear how sensitive and at the same time sluggish the loaded ships were. Any mistake could have had fatal consequences even before the actual journey had begun. The mood among the men was tense. For many, it was the first moment when they really realized the significance of the expedition. As long as they were in preparation, everything had still seemed like a big project. But now that the ships were actually moving, the idea became reality, and reality became a risk that could no longer be avoided. Families and friends had gathered on the shore to say goodbye. They were quiet, often emotional moments, marked by hope, fear, and uncertainty. Some men tried to exude confidence, while others could hardly hide their worries. Because one thing was clear to everyone: not everyone would return. After leaving the river behind, the fleet finally reached the Atlantic. This is where the real part of the journey began. The open ocean lay before them, vast, unpredictable, and full of secrets. For Magellan, this was not unfamiliar territory, but even he knew that this expedition was unlike anything he had experienced before. At the beginning, the journey was comparatively quiet. The ships sailed along the coast, using familiar routes and maintaining close contact with each other. This first phase was important to get used to it, consolidate processes, and prepare the team for the challenges ahead. But even in these first weeks, the first tensions were already apparent. The rivalries among the officers were still present, and the distrust of Magellan had not completely subsided. Some captains questioned his decisions, others doubted his strategy. It was a fragile balance that could tip at any time. Magellan met these challenges with discipline and determination. He maintained his authority and made it clear that he was in control of the expedition. At the same time, he knew that he needed the support of his officers. An open conflict would have jeopardized the entire trip. As the fleet sailed further south, the environment changed. The familiar waters of Europe lay behind them, and before them stretched a coast that was becoming increasingly alien. The landscapes were different, the climate more unpredictable, and the maps became less and less accurate. For many of the men, this was their first contact with a world they only knew from stories. It was a mixture of fascination and fear. Every new coastline, every unknown island could offer opportunities, or harbor dangers. The days on board followed a strict rhythm. Work, watching, repairs, and navigation determined everyday life. Space was limited, and conditions were often harsh. The men lived closely together, and conflict was inevitable. Nevertheless, discipline was crucial to ensure the functioning of the ships. Supply also began to play a role. Although the ships were well loaded, supplies had to be handled carefully. Water was rationed, food had to be preserved, and any waste could have serious consequences later on. As the duration of the trip increased, the feeling of isolation also became stronger. Contact with home was completely severed, and the men were left to fend for themselves. There was no turning back, only the way forward. Magellan knew that this was the decisive moment. The departure was more than just the beginning of a journey, it was a point of no return. Every decision he made would affect the future of the expedition. His vision drove him. He firmly believed that there was a way, that his calculations were correct, and that the journey could be successful. But at the same time, he had to deal with reality, the doubts of his crew, the dangers of the sea and the uncertainty that lay ahead. The further they moved away from Europe, the clearer it became that they were breaking new ground. The known routes ended, and the expedition moved into areas that had been insufficiently explored. This is where the real adventure began. Nature showed its unpredictable side. Storms could come up suddenly, winds could turn, and currents could throw the ships off course. Every day brought new challenges that required experience, skill, and sometimes luck. Despite all these difficulties, the fleet remained intact at first. The ships stuck together, the crew fulfilled their duties, and the journey continued. But under the surface, the tension grew. Doubts, fears, and conflicts were like a quiet rumble that could turn into a storm at any time. For the men on board, the departure was not only a physical journey, but also an internal one. They had to learn to live with the uncertainty, to control their fears, and to rely on each other. It was a test that went far beyond the challenges of seafaring. And as the fleet sailed further and further south, one thing became clearer and clearer: this was no ordinary expedition. It was a venture that demanded everything: courage, perseverance, and the unwavering belief that there was more than just water at the end of the horizon. The departure was complete. The safe world lay behind them, and before them stretched a path that no one had ever walked before. Nobody knew what awaited them. But one thing was certain: there was no turning back. Chapter 6: Across the Atlantic. After the fleet, under the command of Ferdinand Magellan, had taken the final step out into the open ocean, a phase of the journey began that was as decisive as it was grueling: the crossing of the Atlantic. What seemed like a clear, continuous surface on maps turned out to be an endless, living element in reality. Unpredictable, massive, and often hostile. At the beginning, the Atlantic was still comparatively familiar. Many of the sailors had already gained experience on these waters, whether through trading voyages or previous expeditions. But even if parts of the Atlantic were known, this did not mean that they were harmless. The ocean could change in a matter of hours, from calm seas to raging storms that pushed even the most stable ships to their limits. The fleet initially sailed along the known routes to the southwest to take advantage of favorable winds. These so-called trade winds were a decisive factor in the progress of the journey. Without them, the heavy loaded ships would have made slow progress. But even this apparent help from nature could be deceptive. When the winds failed to materialize or turned, the fleet could float almost motionless on the water for days. For the men on board, the real everyday life of seafaring now began. The initial excitement of the departure gave way to a monotonous routine. Days and nights blurred together, while life was confined to the narrow space of the ships. The work was hard and often dangerous. Sails had to be set and hauled in, repairs had to be carried out, and a constant lookout for changes. Navigation was one of the biggest challenges. Without modern instruments, people had to rely on simple tools such as compasses, astrolabe, and observing the stars. But even these methods were not always reliable. Clouds could obscure the view of the sky, currents could change course unnoticed, and small errors could add up to large deviations over days. Magellan relied on his experience and calculations, but he also knew that every decision was a risk. The Atlantic was no room for certainties, only for approximations and conjectures. Over time, life on board also began to change. The supplies, which had seemed plentiful at the beginning, now had to be carefully divided. Fresh water was rationed, and the quality of food declined. The hard ship's bread was often attacked by mold, meat began to spoil, and the diet became monotonous. These conditions affected the crew not only physically, but also psychologically. Tiredness, hunger, and confinement led to tensions. Small conflicts could escalate quickly, and the already fragile atmosphere became increasingly strained. In addition, there was the constant presence of danger. Storms were among the most feared events at sea. When dark clouds rolled in and the wind swelled, everyone on board knew it was getting serious. The ships were tossed to and fro by the waves, the wood creaked, and water penetrated the deck. In such moments, it became clear how well the team worked together, or not. Magellan had to act not only as a navigator in these situations, but also as a leader. His calmness and determination were crucial to avoid panic and stay in control. But he was also aware that not every danger could be controlled. Another problem was communication within the fleet. The 5 ships had to stay as close to each other as possible, but in bad weather or poor visibility they could easily be separated from each other. Signal flags and agreed signs helped, but they were not always sufficient. This uncertainty increased the feeling of isolation. Each ship was on its own, and in an emergency, help could not be guaranteed. For the men, this meant that they had to rely not only on their leadership, but also on each other. As the fleet sailed further south, the climatic conditions changed. The heat increased, the air became more humid, and new challenges emerged. Diseases began to spread, favored by the cramped conditions and lack of hygiene on board. Scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin deficiencies, was one of the biggest dangers. At that time, it was not yet known exactly what the cause was, but the symptoms were known: weakness, bleeding gums, and finally death. Every case of illness weakened the team and made the journey more dangerous. Despite all these difficulties, there were also moments of hope. When the sea was calm and the sky clear, the men could breathe deeply for a short time. Conversations, stories, and memories of home helped to maintain morale. These small moments were important to endure the strains of the journey. Magellan used these phases to motivate his crew and focus on the goal. He reminded them why they were here, what opportunities lay ahead of them, and the significance of their journey. His conviction was contagious, but it could not remove all doubts. The longer the crossing lasted, the stronger the questions became. How far was it? Were they on the right course? Would the supplies be enough? These uncertainties gnawed at the crew and repeatedly tested Magellan's leadership. A particularly critical point was patience. The journey across the Atlantic was not a fast advance, but a slow, often frustrating process. Progress was not always visible, and the feeling of moving in circles could be crippling. But despite all the obstacles, the fleet continued on its way. Day by day, mile by mile, they continued to move towards a continent that was still a mystery to many. South America lay ahead of them, a vast, largely unexplored area that meant both hope and new dangers. When the first signs of land finally became visible, it was a moment of great importance. After weeks on the open sea, the sight of coastlines meant not only orientation, but also relief. It was a sign that they had made progress, that they were getting closer to their goal. But with the rapprochement with the country, new challenges began. Navigation along the coast was complex, the waters often treacherous, and the search for a passage that Magellan so firmly believed he could find was yet to come. The crossing of the Atlantic was therefore more than just a stage. It was a test of perseverance, discipline, and faith. It showed how fragile the expedition was, but also how strong the will to go on could be. And as the fleet approached the shores of South America, it became clear that the uncertainty that lay ahead was even greater than anything they had experienced before. Chapter 7: Mutiny in Patagonia. As the fleet, led by Ferdinand Magellan, reached the shores of South America and worked its way further and further south, not only did the landscape change, but the mood on board also took on a new, more dangerous direction. The crossing of the Atlantic had left its mark. Tiredness, hunger, disease, and increasing insecurity gnawed at the morale of the men. But what was now looming was more than just dissatisfaction. It was the beginning of an open conflict. The region, which would later become known as Patagonia, presented the expedition with new challenges. The coasts were rough, the climate colder and more unpredictable than anything the crew had experienced before. Strong winds whipped across the sea, temperatures dropped, and the days became shorter. For many of the men, this was a completely foreign world, a place that seemed more hostile than inviting. Magellan decided to spend the winter in a sheltered bay. This decision made sense from a navigational point of view. The conditions at sea were too dangerous to continue the journey, and the ships needed time for repairs. But for the crew, this stop meant something else. standstill. The stalemate increased the tensions that had already been building up since the beginning of the expedition. Without the clear goal of the daily journey, dissatisfaction began to spread more widely. Doubts were voiced louder, rumors spread, and trust in Magellan's leadership was increasingly questioned. A central factor was Magellan's origin. As a Portuguese, he led a Spanish expedition, a circumstance that had never been fully accepted. Some Spanish officers saw in him a stranger who had no right to rule over them. This latent tension now developed into open resistance. Among the spokesmen of the opposition were several captains who were critical of Magellan's decisions. They doubted not only his plan, but also his ability to lead the expedition safely. For them, the situation was clear: the journey was too dangerous, the chances of success were too low, and the price might be too high. The demands became increasingly clear. Some wanted to turn back, sail back to Spain, and end the expedition. Others at least pleaded for changing the route or proceeding more cautiously. But Magellan remained steadfast. For him, a retreat was not an option. This attitude eventually led to escalation. On a cold night, while the fleet was lying in the bay, a mutiny occurred. Several captains joined forces to take control of parts of the fleet. Their goal was to remove Magellan from power and to continue the expedition according to their ideas, or to break it off altogether. The situation was extremely dangerous. A mutiny meant a threat not only to the leadership, but to the entire company. Without clear authority, the expedition could break apart, and the men would have been left to fend for themselves in a hostile environment. Magellan reacted quickly and decisively. He knew that hesitation would weaken his position. With strategic skill, he managed to secure the loyalty of part of the crew and take targeted action against the leaders of the mutiny. A decisive moment was the recapture of one of the ships controlled by the mutineers. Through a combination of deception and quick action, Magellan's followers managed to regain control. This success was a turning point, as it showed that the mutiny was not as strong as its leaders had hoped. In the hours and days that followed, Magellan asserted his authority with all his might. The leaders of the mutiny were arrested, interrogated, and finally punished. Some were executed, others abandoned or put in chains. These measures were drastic, but they served a clear purpose: to send an unmistakable signal. For the rest of the crew, this was a moment of clarity. The consequences of an uprising were now obvious, and many chose to keep their doubts to themselves. Discipline has been restored, at least superficially. But the events left their mark. Confidence within the crew was shaken, and relations between the officers remained strained. Magellan had regained control, but the price was high. The expedition was now threatened not only by external dangers, but also by the internal fractures that had formed. Winter in Patagonia dragged on. The men had to cope with the cold, isolation, and limited resources. Repairs were carried out, supplies were checked, and plans were made. But the memory of the mutiny remained present. For Magellan, this was a period of reflection, but also of preparation. He knew that the hardest parts of the journey were yet to come. The search for the passage that would lead him to another sea was not yet complete. And after the events of the mutiny, it was clear that he could not blindly rely on his crew. Despite everything, he remained true to his vision. The mutiny hadn't broken him, it had only made him more determined. For him, this was proof that big projects always meet with resistance. But those who were willing to overcome this resistance could achieve extraordinary things. As winter drew to a close and conditions slowly improved, the fleet prepared to continue the voyage. The ships were made seaworthy again, the crew prepared for their tasks. But nothing was the same as before. The expedition had gone through a crisis that had changed it. The men had seen how quickly doubt could turn into an uprising, and how harsh the consequences were. Chapter 7 thus marks one of the darkest, but also most decisive moments of the journey. It shows that the greatest danger does not always come from the outside, but often from within. And it makes it clear that leadership in such moments requires not only courage, but also determination and sometimes toughness. The fleet was still on course. But the road ahead would not only bring new geographical challenges, but also the question of whether they could survive as a unit. Chapter 8: The Search for the Passage. After the dramatic events of the winter in Patagonia, the expedition led by Ferdinand Magellan reached a decisive point. The mutiny was crushed, discipline was restored, at least outwardly. But the tensions had not completely disappeared. Rather, they had solidified beneath the surface. And as the fleet started moving again, it became clear that the next phase of the journey would be an enormous challenge, not only geographically, but also psychologically. Magellan's goal was unchanged. He was looking for a passage through the South American continent, a sea route that would connect the Atlantic to a previously unknown ocean. This passage was the key to his entire plan. Without them, the expedition would be forced to turn back or look for another way, and neither was out of the question for him. But the problem was obvious. No one knew exactly where this passage could be located, or whether it even existed. The maps available to Magellan were incomplete and often contradictory. Some pointed to possible passages, others made the continent seem an insurmountable obstacle. For Magellan, however, this was no reason to give up. On the contrary, it was a challenge that drove his spirit of discovery. The fleet continued to sail along the coast, always looking for signs of an opening, bay, or channel leading inland. Every cut in the coastline was closely examined. Small boats were sent out to explore waters, measure depths, and check possible passages. This search was tedious and time-consuming. Often it led nowhere. Many of the supposed passages turned out to be dead ends, river mouths or bays that did not lead any further. Each of these disappointments cost time, energy, and morale. This phase became increasingly stressful for the team. The constant uncertainty, the feeling of searching in circles, and the memory of the exertions of winter had an effect on the mood. Doubts were voiced again, albeit more cautiously than before. A particularly drastic event was the loss of one of the ships. The Santiago, which had been sent ahead for reconnaissance, got caught in a storm and was destroyed. Although a large part of the crew survived, the loss of the ship was a heavy blow. It not only reduced the strength of the fleet, but also increased the feeling of vulnerability. For Magellan, this was a critical moment. He had to decide whether to continue the search or turn back. Many would have chosen to retreat in this situation, but Magellan remained true to his line. For him, the passage was not just a goal, it was proof of the correctness of his vision. With an unwavering will, he continued the search. The landscape became increasingly rough. The coasts were rugged, the weather changeable and often extreme. Strong winds and cold temperatures made navigation difficult. At the same time, communication between the ships became more complicated, as fog and storms limited visibility. Despite all these difficulties, there were also moments of hope. Again and again, the men came across new clues, unusual currents, changed watercolors, or animal movements that could indicate that there was a larger water connection nearby. Magellan watched these signs closely. His experience as a seafarer helped him identify patterns and make decisions that might have seemed risky to others. He trusted not only in maps, but also in his intuition and his feeling for the sea. This combination of knowledge and instinct was crucial, because the search for the passage was not a linear process. There was no clear path, no firm clues. It was a constant balancing, a game between hope and disappointment. The crew began to feel the strain more and more. Supplies became scarcer, physical exhaustion increased, and psychological stress grew. Every new failure gnawed at morale. Every lost day seemed to confirm the doubts. But at the same time, there was also another development. Some men began to admire Magellan's determination. Despite all the setbacks, he did not give up. He stayed focused, made decisions, and continued the expedition. This attitude had a stabilizing effect on many, even if it could not remove all doubts. The search became a kind of test, not only of geographical possibilities, but also of human stamina. It showed how far the men were willing to go to achieve a goal that they themselves could not fully understand. With every kilometer covered, the tension grew. The question was no longer just whether the passage existed, but also whether they would find it in time. Time was working against them, and resources were limited. Then, after weeks of searching, something began to change. The coastline suddenly showed new shapes. The waters became deeper, the currents more complex. It wasn't clear evidence, but it was a clue, a possible sign that they were approaching something significant. Magellan recognized the significance of this moment. He had the fleet proceed cautiously. Every movement was precisely coordinated. It was a moment in which everything could be decided. The men felt it too. The atmosphere on board changed. Tiredness turned into tense expectation, doubt into cautious hope. It was as if the expedition was on the threshold of something new. Chapter 8 ends at exactly this point, at the border between search and discovery. The passage had not yet been found, but it seemed closer than ever. The trip had shown how difficult it was to explore the unknown. She had demanded victims, raised doubts, and shown the limits of resilience. But she had also proven that perseverance and belief in an idea can carry even in the most difficult moments. And as the fleet slowly felt its way forward, it became clear that the breakthrough was within reach. Chapter 9: The Discovery of the Strait of Magellan. The weeks-long search had pushed the men to their limits. Doubt, exhaustion, and the incessant confrontation with the unknown had characterized the expedition. But it was precisely at this moment, when hope and despair were close together, that the tide was to turn. The fleet, led by Ferdinand Magellan, was on the verge of finding what it had been looking for so long, the passage. It started with small signs. The coastline along which they sailed looked different than before. Instead of straight sections and clear bays, it now showed deeply cut fjords and branching waterways. The currents changed, became more complex, and the water seemed to move in directions that were no longer determined solely by the open sea. Magellan immediately realized that this was no ordinary stretch of the coast. Something was different, and it was precisely this different that could be the key. Carefully, he let the ship sail into the opening. It was a risky step. No one knew how far this waterway led, whether it would narrow or end in a dead end. But it was precisely this uncertainty that was part of the discovery. The fleet moved slowly forward. Small exploration boats were sent out to measure the depth and identify possible dangers. Navigation was extremely difficult. The narrow passages, changing currents, and unpredictable winds made every movement a challenge. The men on board were tense. Everyone knew that they were in an area that had never been crossed by European sailors before. It was a moment in which history and the present intersected, a step into the unknown that could change everything. Day by day, the fleet continued to feel its way forward. The landscape was impressive and threatening at the same time. High, rugged mountains towered on both sides, often covered in snow. The waters were dark and deep, and the silence was broken only by the wind and the creaking of the ships. This environment had an almost unreal effect on the crew. It was as if they had entered another world, a world that was neither familiar nor welcoming. But it was precisely in this strangeness that the meaning of what they did lay. Magellan remained calm and concentrated. For him, this was the moment he had been working towards for so long. His vision began to take shape. Each section covered confirmed his conviction that there was a path through the continent. But the passage was not an easy passage. It was long, winding, and full of challenges. Decisions had to be made again and again. Which arm led further? Which route was safe? Which current could be used? Mistakes could have fatal consequences here. A wrong course could lead the ships into dangerous waters or cost valuable time. And time was a decisive factor. Supplies were limited, and conditions became increasingly difficult. Another setback hit the expedition when one of the ships, the San Antonio, suddenly disappeared. She had moved away from the fleet and did not return. Later it turned out that the crew mutinied and made their way back to Spain. This loss was a heavy blow. not only because of the ship itself, but also because of the psychological effect. He showed that the unity of the fleet was still fragile and that not everyone was ready to follow the path to the end. But Magellan did not let that stop him either. He continued the passage with the remaining ships. For him it was clear, now there was no turning back. The passage dragged on for weeks. Each stage brought new challenges, but also new certainties. The waters continued, branched out and opened up again. It was not a closed system, but a network of paths, and that is exactly what made it so difficult, but also so important. Finally, the moment came that changed everything. The water opened up in front of them. The narrow passages surrounded by land gave way to a wide, open area. The horizon was clear, the sea stretched seemingly endlessly. It was the moment when it became clear, they had made it. Magellan and his men had found a connection between two oceans. The emotions on board were overwhelming. Relief, joy, and amazement mixed into a feeling that was difficult to put into words. After all the hardships, doubts, and losses, they had proved that Magellan's vision was correct. This new waterway would later become known as the Strait of Magellan, a name that still commemorates this historic moment today. But for the men who passed through it, it was more than just a geographical discovery. It was a symbol of overcoming borders. The significance of this discovery could not be fully grasped at this time. But one thing was clear, they had achieved something that no one had done before. They had found a way where others had only seen an obstacle. Magellan himself showed a mixture of pride and calm at that moment. For him, this was not an end, but a transition. The passage had been found, but the journey was far from over. In front of them lay a new ocean, larger and more unknown than anything they had experienced before. But unlike before, they now had a decisive advantage. They knew that their path was possible. Chapter 9 thus marks a turning point in the expedition. It is the moment when search becomes certainty, doubt becomes knowledge. But at the same time, it opens the door to new challenges. For the ocean that now lay before them would test them in a whole new way. The discovery of the Strait of Magellan was not just a triumph, it was the beginning of a new, even greater adventure. Chapter 10: The Pacific Ocean. After the fleet, led by Ferdinand Magellan, had crossed the narrow, dangerous passage and finally reached the open sea, something that was both hope and threat lay before them, an ocean larger than anything they had imagined. Magellan called it Mar Pacifico, the calm ocean, a name that was initially supposed to seem deceptive. The first impression was indeed calm. After the stormy, unpredictable waters of the passage, this new sea seemed almost peaceful. The waves were more steady, the winds gentler, and the water stretched seemingly endlessly to the horizon. For a brief moment, it felt as if they had left the hardest behind them. But this calm was only the surface. Magellan was convinced that the Spice Islands could not be far away now. His calculations suggested that the crossing of this new ocean would be comparatively fast. But this was exactly where one of the biggest mistakes of the entire expedition lay. The vastness of the Pacific was completely underestimated at that time. What was planned as a stage of a few weeks developed into a months-long journey without interruption. No land in sight, no safe havens, no way to replenish supplies. Only water, in all directions. With each passing day, it became clearer that they were in one of the largest and unexplored spaces on Earth. Life on board changed drastically. The supplies, which were already scarce, began to run out. Fresh water was strictly rationed, and food increasingly lost quality. The ship's bread was streaked with worms, the meat was spoiled, and even the water was beginning to take on an unpleasant taste. The men were faced with a harsh reality. They had to eat what they had, or starve. In their desperation, they resorted to things they could not even have imagined at the beginning of the journey. Pieces of leather, which originally served as protection or equipment, were cooked and eaten. Rats that had nested on the ships became a sought-after source of food. Food became a precious commodity, and every bite could make the difference between life and death. But hunger was not the only threat. Diseases spread, especially scurvy. Without fresh food, men lacked important nutrients and their bodies began to weaken. Bleeding gums, pain, and extreme exhaustion were just some of the symptoms. Many lost their strength, could no longer fulfill their tasks, and became a burden for the already weakened team. Death became a constant companion. Again and again, men died as a result of hunger, disease, or exhaustion. Their bodies were handed over to the sea, a silent, routine ritual that reflected the reality of the situation. For the survivors, every loss was another blow to morale. The psychological stress was enormous. The endless expanse of the ocean, the lack of landmarks, and the monotonous environment led to a feeling of isolation that was hard to describe. Days passed into each other, and hope began to fade. Many wondered if they would ever reach land. Magellan faced one of his greatest challenges as a leader during this phase. His original calculations had proven to be wrong, and the situation was becoming increasingly critical. But he was not allowed to show any weakness. The crew needed a leader who believed in success, even when the circumstances spoke against it. He stuck to his course. This decision was risky, perhaps even desperate. But she was also consistent. A change of direction would have brought new uncertainties, and there was no guarantee that a different path would have been better. Magellan relied on perseverance. The days became weeks, the weeks became months. The number of survivors decreased, the strength dwindled, and hope became a fragile commodity. Nevertheless, the fleet continued to move, slowly but steadily. And then, after a seemingly endless time, something changed. Birds have been sighted. It was a small sign, but of great importance. Birds meant land nearby. For the men, this was a moment of hope, proof that their journey did not lead nowhere. Shortly afterwards, islands actually appeared on the horizon. The joy was overwhelming. After months on the open sea, the sight of land meant more than just a geographical discovery. It was the salvation. Fresh water, food, and the opportunity to relax were suddenly within reach. But even this moment was not without challenges. The first encounters with the islanders were tense. Misunderstandings, cultural differences, and the tense situation of the crew led to conflicts. What began as hope partly developed into confrontation. Nevertheless, it was possible to replenish supplies and continue the journey. The men were weakened, but they had survived. Crossing the Pacific had changed her. They had reached the limits of their resilience and exceeded them. Magellan himself had gained a decisive insight in this phase. The world was bigger than even he had assumed. His vision had been right, but reality had surpassed it to an extent that was hard to imagine. Chapter 10 thus shows one of the toughest stages of the entire expedition. It is a story of perseverance, desperation, and the unwavering will to move on, even when everything speaks against it. The calm ocean had proven to be anything but still. He had demanded, checked, and changed. But in the end, he had not stopped the expedition. And that's exactly what made it one of the most important stages of this journey. Chapter 11. Encounters in the Far East. After the deprivation of crossing the Pacific, the expedition entered a new phase of its journey under the leadership of Ferdinand Magellan. For the first time in months, they were no longer alone facing the open sea, but encountered inhabited islands, foreign cultures, and people whose way of life was fundamentally different from their own. It was a moment that not only brought relief, but also brought new challenges. The first islands they reached belonged to a region that was largely unknown to Europeans. For the men, this meant a mixture of hope and uncertainty. After the extreme shortage of food and water, any possibility of supply was invaluable. But at the same time, it was unclear how the encounters with the locals would go. The first contacts were cautious, characterized by curiosity on both sides. The islanders approached the foreign ships with interest, while the Europeans tried to make their intentions understood. Language was a major obstacle. There was no common basis for understanding, and so gestures, signs, and simple exchanges had to suffice. Trade quickly became a central element of these encounters. The Europeans offered metal objects, fabrics, and other goods that were of great value to the islanders. In return, they received fresh food, water, and other much-needed resources. This exchange was beneficial for both sides, but it was also fragile. Because behind the apparent harmony, there were misunderstandings. What was a clearly regulated exchange for the Europeans could be interpreted differently by the locals. Property, possession, and trade did not have the same meaning everywhere. These differences repeatedly led to tensions. A particularly formative moment was when some of the islanders began to take items from the ships without any direct exchange. To Europeans, this seemed like theft, while from the point of view of the locals, it may have had a different meaning. The reaction of the crew was correspondingly harsh, and the first conflicts arose. These encounters made it clear how difficult it was to deal with completely foreign cultures. It was not just about language, but about fundamental differences in thinking and behavior. For the expedition, this meant that every contact had to be handled carefully. Despite these difficulties, the stays on the islands were of great importance. The men were able to recover, replenish their supplies, and gather new strength. The effects of the long sea voyage were still felt, but the opportunity to obtain fresh food brought a significant improvement. Magellan used this phase not only for supply, but also for orientation. He collected information, observed the surroundings, and tried to determine his position more precisely. For him, the islands were not only stopovers, but also clues on the way to his actual destination, the Spice Islands. With each new contact, the understanding of the diversity of the world also grew. The men saw new landscapes, new ways of life, and new forms of community. These experiences broadened her horizons, literally and figuratively. But not all encounters were peaceful. In some cases, tensions arose that quickly came to a head. The tense situation of the crew, the differences in cultures, and the uncertainty on both sides meant that conflicts were often difficult to avoid. Magellan tried to control these situations, but he did not always succeed. Balancing diplomacy and enforcement was difficult, especially in an environment that was new to everyone involved. An important aspect of this phase was also the role of religion. The expedition brought not only trade and discovery, but also an attempt to spread the Christian faith. For Magellan, this was part of his mission, and he saw it as a way to build relationships with the locals. But here, too, there were challenges. The ideas, rituals, and beliefs of the islanders were very different from those of the Europeans. What was self-evident for some could seem incomprehensible or even threatening to others. These attempts at rapprochement were therefore often complex and not always successful. As the expedition continued to travel through the islands of the Far East, it became clear that it was moving in a space that was rich in opportunities, but also full of risks. Every new contact could mean progress or danger. For the men, this phase was a kind of transition. After the isolation of the ocean, they were now connected to the world again, but it was a world they had to understand first. Magellan himself remained focused. Despite all the new impressions, he did not lose sight of his goal. The Spice Islands were still his destination, and every decision was measured against it. Chapter 11 thus shows a new dimension of the journey. It is no longer just about overcoming geographical obstacles, but also about navigating between cultures, expectations, and misunderstandings. The encounters in the Far East were more than just stopovers. They were moments of learning, adaptation, and sometimes conflict. And as the expedition moved on, it became clear that the biggest challenge was not always the sea, but understanding a world that was bigger and more diverse than they had ever imagined. Chapter 12: The Philippines. As the expedition under the leadership of Ferdinand Magellan continued to cross the islands, it finally reached an area that would prove to be particularly formative for the rest of the journey: the Philippines. After the months of deprivation at sea and the first cautious contacts with foreign cultures, these islands initially offered something that the men had long lacked: stability, supplies, and seemingly friendly encounters. The arrival on the islands was marked by curiosity on both sides. The inhabitants approached the foreign ships with interest, while the Europeans hoped to find here not only supplies, but also allies. In contrast to previous encounters, the first contacts were surprisingly positive. There was an exchange of gifts, conversations, as far as this was possible despite language barriers, and a cautious building of trust. For Magellan, this was an opportunity that went beyond mere supply. He quickly realized that these islands were not just a stopover, but a place where he could exert influence. His mission was not only geographical, but also political and religious. The spread of the Christian faith played an important role in this. A central moment was the encounter with a local ruler who was open to contact and cooperation. Through skillful diplomacy, Magellan managed to establish a relationship based on mutual benefit. Europeans provided support, knowledge, and access to new trade opportunities, while locals provided food, shelter, and guidance. This alliance seemed to be mutually beneficial. For the exhausted crew, it meant safety and relaxation. For Magellan, it was proof that his mission could not only be successful, but also influential. But it was precisely this success that was also the danger. Magellan began to interfere more strongly in the local structures. He no longer saw himself only as an explorer, but also as a mediator, perhaps even as an authority. This role put him in a position far beyond what was necessary for the actual expedition. A decisive turning point was the decision to intervene in a local conflict. In the Philippines, there were different groups and power structures that did not always coexist peacefully with each other. One of the local leaders asked Magellan for support against a rival chief. For Magellan, this was an opportunity to demonstrate his power and strengthen the alliance. He also saw it as an opportunity to consolidate the influence of Christianity. But this decision was risky. The men of his crew were exhausted, their numbers were reduced, and they were far from any support. A military intervention meant a high risk, one that not everyone considered justified. Nevertheless, Magellan decided to intervene. The preparation for the conflict already showed the difficulties. While the Europeans were equipped with weapons superior to the natives, they were outnumbered and found themselves in an environment they did not fully understand. The attack took place on the island of Mactan, where the local leader resisted Magellan's influence. What was planned as a demonstration of strength quickly developed into a confusing and dangerous situation. The conditions were difficult. Shallow water prevented the ships from getting close enough to the coast, so that the men were forced to attack on foot. At the same time, the defenders knew the terrain very well and skillfully exploited this advantage. The fight was intense and chaotic. The numerical superiority of the locals quickly became noticeable, and the Europeans came under pressure. Despite their better equipment, they could not break the resistance. In the midst of this battle, Magellan fell. His death was a shock for the entire expedition. The man who had planned, guided, and driven the trip forward despite all the resistance was suddenly no longer there. His loss was not only a personal, but also a structural break. The leadership of the expedition was now unclear. Decisions previously made by Magellan now had to be taken over by others, often under difficult conditions and without clear orientation. For the crew, this moment meant a turning point. The security that Magellan's leadership had offered, despite all the conflicts, had disappeared. It was replaced by uncertainty. The relationship with the locals also changed. The alliance that had previously been built up was shaken, and trust could no longer be taken for granted. The Europeans now had to act more cautiously and redefine their position. Despite this serious setback, the expedition was not over. The remaining leaders decided to continue the journey. Their destination, the Spice Islands, was still achievable, and the thought of giving up after all the sacrifices was unacceptable to many. Chapter 12 thus shows one of the most dramatic turning points of the entire journey. It is the moment when a success story becomes a crisis, when leadership is lost and new ways have to be found. Magellan's death marks the end of a chapter, but not the end of the expedition. The journey continues, but it will never be the same again. Chapter 13, Death of Magellan. The Philippines had brought the expedition under the leadership of Ferdinand Magellan to the edge of its physical, psychological, and organizational capacity. After months of deprivation, storms, illness, and internal tension, the crew was now forced to face not only the physical challenges of the island world, but also the political and cultural complexities that came with foreign societies. In this precarious situation, the fate of the expedition was to come to a head in a dramatic way. Magellan had been trying to gain influence since her arrival in the Philippines. He was convinced that the mission of the expedition included not only sailing around the world, but also the spread of the Christian faith and the establishment of political alliances. The island of Mactan became a central point of these efforts. A local chief, Lapu-Lapu, lived here, who resisted Magellan's demands and defended his independence. This confrontation was soon to escalate. Magellan decided that direct military intervention was necessary. He planned to lead a small force on land to break the influence of Lapu-Lapu and demonstrate the Christian mission. The preparations were meticulous, but the conditions were far from ideal. European weapons and tactics were only partially effective for the dense coastal area and shallow shorelines, and the troops were vastly outnumbered. Nevertheless, Magellan sent his men forward, convinced of the need to show authority and secure the mission. On the morning of the decisive battle, the European soldiers gathered on the beach. The water often reached up to the waist, and walking on the swampy ground made any movement difficult. The local warriors were well prepared, knew the terrain, and used the natural environment to their advantage. They moved deftly between the rocks and shallow waters, while the Europeans struggled forward. The fight began fiercely. The local warriors used spears, projectiles, and a variety of other weapons, which they mastered masterfully. The European formation was difficult to maintain due to the difficult conditions, and the superior equipment could only be partially used. Magellan himself led his men at the head, fought personally, and tried to stabilize the ranks. But the numerical superiority and local knowledge of the locals quickly became noticeable. The Europeans came under pressure, and despite all their bravery, the formation threatened to fall apart. Magellan was in the middle of the action, constantly between attack and retreat to coordinate his men. At a crucial moment, he himself was seriously wounded. Several spears hit him, and the injuries were immediately life-threatening. The soldiers around him fought desperately to protect him, but the terrain and the superiority of the opponents made any rescue operation difficult. Magellan knew that his end was near. Nevertheless, he showed extraordinary determination and tried to continue leading his men. His presence was a moral anchor for the troops, and even in the face of death, he tried to maintain cohesion. Eventually, however, the wounds overwhelmed him, and he fell to the ground, overwhelmed by the warriors of Chief Lapu-Lapu. Magellan's death came as a shock to the entire expedition. The men, who had endured months of suffering, hunger, and struggle together, now saw their leader fall. For many, this was a moment of deepest despair, not only because of the loss of a leader, but also because of the uncertainty about how to continue the journey. In the hours and days following Magellan's death, the expedition's leadership structures showed their most critical side. The crew had to reorganize. Leaders had to take over the role that Magellan had previously held. Decisions about navigation, supplies, and morale now fell on a handful of officers, who had to both process the loss and keep the expedition stable. The immediate consequences of the battle were brutal. Numerous men were killed or injured, and the physical exhaustion of the survivors was extreme. The psychological pressure, the loss of the leader, the constant danger, and the unclear future weighed on each individual. Some men now openly doubted the group's ability to successfully complete the circumnavigation of the world. At the same time, the expedition began to make pragmatic decisions in order to survive. Supplies were rationed, injured men were treated, the ships repaired, and a preliminary strategy for the onward journey was developed. The leadership now had to not only keep an eye on the goal, but also ensure the motivation and cohesion of the survivors, under conditions that pushed even experienced seafarers to their limits. Despite the catastrophic losses and the immediate threat, a remarkable aspect of human adaptability was revealed. The crew quickly learned to redistribute tasks, build trust with new leaders, and focus on the remaining resources. In this struggle for survival, a kind of pragmatic community emerged. based less on hierarchy and more on cooperation. The geographical location of the Philippines made the situation even more difficult. The island world was complex, with countless bays, coastlines, and unpredictable currents. Navigation was demanding, and without Magellan, decisions about course and direction now had to be made collectively. This uncertainty increased the risk of further conflict, both within the crew and in relations with the locals. Nevertheless, the expedition managed to survive the immediate crisis. Through quick organizational adjustments, a focus on survival and navigation, and constant observation of the environment, the fleet was stabilized. Magellan's death was tragic and significant, but the mission itself, the circumnavigation of the world, remained possible. Chapter 13 impressively shows how thin the line between success and disaster was in such an extreme expedition. Magellan had achieved incredible feats as a visionary, navigator, and leader, but even he could not fully control the dangers of the environment and the forces of human reality. His death marked the end of an era within the expedition, but at the same time the beginning of a new phase in which the survivors had to learn to continue without him. The events on Mactan are not only a testament to the physical and tactical challenges of this expedition, but also a profound reflection on leadership, courage, risk, and the resilience of human communities in extreme situations. Magellan's vision had changed the world, but his personal fate was a reminder that even the greatest explorers are at the mercy of the forces of nature, foreign cultures, and their own human limitations. Chapter 14: The Return of the Victoria. After the tragic death of Ferdinand Magellan in the Philippines, the expedition was faced with an existential crisis. The crew was weakened, the ships damaged, and the way back home seemed as uncertain as it was dangerous. Nevertheless, the survivors decided to continue the mission. At its head now came Juan Sebastián Elcano, an experienced officer who had previously served under Magellan's command and now took on the responsibility of completing the circumnavigation of the world. Under his leadership, the Victoria, the only ship in the original fleet that would survive the entire voyage, would eventually make the return to Spain. The situation was precarious. Of the 5 ships with which the expedition had begun, only the Victoria and a few smaller units remained, most of which had been lost, destroyed, mutinously returned, or abandoned during the months-long journey. The crew was severely decimated. Many men were marked by illness, hunger, and the hardships of the sea voyage. The moral burden was enormous. They had lost their leader, countless comrades had died, and the uncertainty about the further course of the expedition weighed heavily on everyone. Elcano took on this responsibility with determination. He knew that every decision was now a matter of life and death. The remaining crew had to be managed in a disciplined manner, supplies had to be strictly rationed, and the ships had to be kept seaworthy. At the same time, it was his job to keep the spirit of the men alive, in a moment when hope and despair were close together. The return journey to the west was associated with numerous challenges. The Spice Islands were still far away, and the fleet had to navigate dangerous waters. Storms, changeable winds, and unpredictable currents made the journey a daily test. In addition, the ship was isolated on the open ocean, no contact with the outside world, no way to get help quickly. Any mistake could have fatal consequences. Nevertheless, Elcano showed remarkable organizational talent. He carefully planned the route, taking into account seasonal weather conditions and guiding the crew through the most dangerous passages. In doing so, he also had to manage the psychological state of the men. Hunger, disease, and the memory of the previous losses put a strain on morale, and each new setback threatened to undermine discipline. Through clear structures, distribution of tasks, and constant motivation, he succeeded in keeping the crew engaged. The voyage took the Victoria along unknown coasts and through the vastness of the Indian Ocean. New challenges arose, currents that made maps and calculations difficult, and dangerous coastal regions that required navigational talent and courage. Elcano showed skills not only as a navigator, but also as a leader who could resolve conflicts and unite the crew. His pragmatic leadership style helped to minimize internal tensions and keep a clear view of the goal, returning home. On the way, the survivors gained further valuable experiences. They observed foreign countries, cultures, and natural phenomena, collected map information, and documented their findings. This data was invaluable for the European world. It expanded geographical knowledge, provided insights into trade, flora and fauna, and confirmed for the first time the spherical shape of the Earth through the continuous circumnavigation. However, the return was not just a matter of navigation. The physical and psychological strain on the crew was enormous. Many men were weakened by scurvy, exhaustion, and injuries. Food and drinking water were limited, and the cramped conditions on board made life even more difficult. Every day at sea meant risk, and every mistake could mean the end of the expedition. Despite these adversities, the Victoria remained on course, a symbol of perseverance and the will to survive. The last weeks of the trip were particularly challenging. The crew was weakened, supplies were scarce, and the danger of going off course was great. Elcano led the men through this phase with iron discipline. He clearly assigned tasks, monitored supplies, and motivated the men through constant communication and small rituals. At the same time, he showed compassion for the weaker, recognized the strain of the long journey, and adjusted the daily routine to avoid overload. Finally, after more than 3 years at sea, the survivors saw the coasts of Spain. The return was triumphant. Despite the losses, hardships, and challenges, the expedition had successfully completed the circumnavigation of the world. The Victoria returned to the port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda, loaded with spices, new insights, and the confirmation of a historic victory. The Earth was indeed round, and it was possible to circumnavigate it completely. The significance of this return was enormous. For Spain, it meant prestige, economic opportunity, and geopolitical power. For science, the expedition provided valuable data on geography, navigation, and the world's oceans. For humanity, it was a symbol of the spirit of discovery, courage, and the ability to overcome extreme challenges. The survivors of the Victoria became heroes. Its history inspired generations of seafarers and explorers. At the same time, the price of the expedition remained clearly visible. Hundreds of men had lost their lives, and the original leader, Magellan, had sacrificed his life in the Philippines. The return was therefore not only a triumph, but also a memorial to the risks and sacrifices associated with great discoveries. Chapter 14 shows that despite all adversity, losses, and human tragedies, the will to achieve a goal can give immeasurable power. Under the leadership of Juan Sebastián Elcano, the Victoria completed the circumnavigation of the world, a milestone in history that changed the world forever and laid the foundations for further discoveries. The return of the Victoria was more than just the homecoming of a ship. It was proof that human courage, determination, and cohesion can triumph even under the most extreme conditions. Chapter 15: The Legacy of the Journey. The return of the Victoria to Spain in 1522 marked not only the end of one of the most spectacular voyages of discovery in human history, but also the beginning of a profound change in science, trade, politics, and understanding of the world. The expedition led by Ferdinand Magellan, overshadowed by his death but successfully completed by Juan Sebastián Elcano, had completed the first complete circumnavigation of the Earth, thus expanding the horizon of Europe forever. This legacy was multi-layered and far-reaching, far beyond the mere return of a ship. First of all, the expedition fundamentally changed the geographical knowledge of Europe. Until this trip, many parts of the world were only vaguely marked on maps. There were theories about the expansion of continents, seas, islands, and trade routes, but concrete findings were lacking. By circumnavigating the Earth, it has now been possible for the first time to collect precise observations of longitude and latitude, map coastlines, and check the vastness of the oceans. The fact that a ship could sail the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Sea without interruption proved the spherical shape of the Earth in a practically comprehensible way and dispelled doubts, rumors, and traditional misinformation. In addition, the expedition fundamentally changed maritime navigation. The collected data on currents, winds, coastal formations, and island groups were recorded in maps, which were henceforth indispensable for later seafarers. Techniques for determining longitude and latitude were made more precise, and experience in dealing with the challenges of long sea voyages formed the basis for the epoch of great discoveries. The methods of Magellan and Elcano set standards for the next generation of captains, cartographers and explorers who began to systematically explore the globe. The economic impact was also significant. Despite all the losses, the expedition had brought back valuable spices, fabrics, and trade goods. But the real value lay not only in the material goods, but in the demonstration that the world in its dimensions was connectable. Spain realized that there was a western sea route to the Spice Islands, and that the Portuguese monopoly trade via Africa could be circumvented. This realization changed trade strategies, led to new expeditions, and intensified the competition between European powers for global dominance. The vision of a global trade network began to take shape. Politically, the expedition also had far-reaching consequences. It demonstrated the possibilities of exercising power over distant regions, forming alliances with local rulers and asserting European interests. At the same time, it showed the limits of this power. The conflicts in the Philippines, especially the resistance of Lapu-Lapu, were a reminder that the enforcement of European control in distant regions was complex, risky, and not without sacrifices. The political dimension of the expedition had an impact on the strategy of Spain and other nations for decades, highlighting the value of diplomacy, military presence, and cultural influence. On a human level, the legacy of the expedition was as impressive as it was harrowing. The survivors of the Victoria had experienced unimaginable deprivation: storms, diseases, hunger, psychological stress, and the loss of hundreds of comrades. Magellan's death on Mactan showed the dangers faced by even experienced sailors and reminded us that every voyage of discovery meant a risk to the extreme. The stories of the men who returned inspired generations of explorers, researchers, and writers. They embodied courage, perseverance, sacrifice, and the unconditional will to cross boundaries. The expedition also had religious and cultural effects. Magellan's mission involved not only geographical exploration, but also the spread of the Christian faith in foreign regions. While many of his attempts to strengthen alliances through religion met with resistance or ended tragically, they laid the foundation for later contacts and missionary work in Southeast Asia. The encounters with the cultures of the Philippines and the islands in the Pacific opened up new perspectives for Europe on foreign societies, their ways of life, trade structures, and political systems. These intercultural experiences changed Europeans' understanding of the world and the role of their own continent in it. The trip also left a lasting legacy for science. Observations of the animal and plant world, climate conditions, and ocean currents were documented and analyzed. This empirical data expanded the scientific knowledge of the time and laid the foundation for systematic research into unknown regions. The experiences from the expedition later led to more precise charts, improved navigational instruments, and new approaches to seafaring, which further accelerated the era of discovery. Psychologically and socially, the expedition illustrated the stresses that people can survive in extreme situations, and the limits that are reached. The mutinies, the death of Magellan, and the hardships of the Pacific showed the range of human reactions, from courage, cohesion, and adaptability to despair, conflict, and surrender. These experiences were documented, told, and reflected on, and shaped European awareness of the demands of global enterprises. After all, the expedition also had symbolic significance. The fact that the Earth could be completely circumnavigated not only literally turned the maps of Europe upside down, but also the way we think about the world. It opened up to people the idea of a global space that was connected and travelable. This new worldview had a long-term effect on trade, science, politics, and philosophy, and prepared the ground for the globalization of the following centuries. The legacy of the trip is therefore multi-layered: geographically, economically, politically, scientifically, culturally, and humanly. Magellan's vision, realized by Elcano and the survivors despite his death, proved that even the greatest challenges can be overcome when courage, planning, and perseverance come together. The Victoria returned not only as a ship, but as a symbol of the spirit of discovery, humanity, willingness to make sacrifices, and the boundless curiosity of man. Chapter 15 concludes by showing that the expedition was much more than a maritime undertaking. It changed the world, not immediately, but permanently. It laid the foundations for global trade, scientific exploration, intercultural encounters, and a new understanding of the planet. It is proof that discoveries that require courage, intelligence, and perseverance have the potential to profoundly shape humanity. The legacy of the Magellan expedition lives on to this day, in the maps it left behind, in the insights it brought, in the stories of courage and sacrifice, and in the unshakable belief that the horizon is not the end, but the beginning of new possibilities. It remains a reminder that the world is not only discovered by chance, but by vision, determination, and the willingness to go beyond the known.